Good morning and welcome to the Water Bootcamp brought to you by the California Water Institute at Fresno State. We hope you enjoyed the Fresno State Jazz Band while we got started. My name is Victoria Vera and I am a junior at Fresno State studying business, and I will be the moderator for these sessions. As I mentioned earlier, these virtual education sessions are brought to you by the California Water Institute at Fresno State. CWI is celebrating 25 years of working to integrate and coordinate Fresno State's interdisciplinary research and education of water-related programs. We do this in collaboration with water stakeholders to facilitate the development and communication of research-based solutions to water challenges in California. The mission of CWI is to connect academia to the water community to solve water management challenges through education and research. To achieve this, we engage faculty and students in developing interdisciplinary research-based solutions to water challenges for a sustainable water future. In celebration of Water Awareness Month, CWI is hosting 3 water boot camps in English and 1 in Spanish this month. This morning's session is all about groundwater, starting with an overview of it following by recharge and lastly regulations. You can submit questions as we go on the YouTube chat feature. There is a slight delay between the presentations, so please ask your questions as they come to mind so we make sure the speakers are able to get them on time. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. This session speaker is CWI's Assistant Director Cordy Qualley. Assistant Director Qualley has been working on water issues for over 40 years and was most recently a faculty in the Civil Engineering Department at Fresno State. And now to provide you with an overview about groundwater, it is my pleasure to welcome Assistant Director Qualley to the virtual stage.
Thank you, Victoria, and for that introduction. Appreciate it. And welcome to this session of Groundwater Overview. And we're just going to do a kind of a 20,000, 15,000 foot overview of what is groundwater, the hydrology behind it, and then how is it, how do we understand groundwater in the Central Valley, and finally take a quick look at what are some issues with groundwater in terms of quality. There we go. Sorry. Okay. So first, we're going to talk about hydrologic regions within the Central Valley. What are aquifers? Some of you may be interested in trying to understand what is subsidence and what causes it. It's a problem that's prevalent in the Central Valley due to our unique geology. And then we want to take a quick look at contamination, sources of contamination, or what are the types of constituents you might find in your local groundwater, and then an overview of kind of treatment. So if you are interested in how do cities treat groundwater to make it safe to drink, and or how might you do that in your own home, we'll talk a little bit about that. None of this is exhaustive. Again, it's going to be a little bit of a high overview type of approach. First, this is sort of just a picture of the hydrologic cycle. We've talked about it many times. You've heard about this previously from Laura. And so in terms of groundwater, how do we get groundwater, or where does groundwater come from? Essentially, it is a result of the infiltration and percolation of surface water into the groundwater table. This isn't completely 100% all groundwater doesn't come this way, but a good percentage of it does. So in the case of the Central Valley, we have a couple of sources. One is the just natural rainfall that occurs on the valley floor and in the foothills that infiltrates through that groundwater surface and then percolates down deep into the aquifer. Some of it is retained in what we call the vadose zone, which is this level between the surface of the ground surface and then the water table itself, where the soils become completely saturated. So in the saturated area, that's what we call the groundwater table. But in the area that's not fully saturated, that's the vadose zone. So the water down through the vadose zone through percolation into the deep water table. Other source of groundwater for us is the snowmelt that happens from the Sierra Nevada that flows down through the various streams that are in the course through the valley, and most of them are impounded in reservoirs and at the foothill level area where a good deal of percolation and occurs. And then also because as these streams pass through the valley, they are what we call exfiltrating streams, so basically are rivers. So that means that water is moving from these riverine systems deep in. Some of it percolates deep into the groundwater. So again, for us, as we look at it, most of our groundwater is a result of uh, surface water. The third one, which isn't shown here, but you need to be aware of, is basically we do a lot of artificial groundwater recharge here in the valley, which means that it isn't naturally occurring due to rainfall or percolation from streams, but we're actually impounding surface water in those areas where we have good soil strata that can promote that percolation into the groundwater. And Laura will talk about that more going forward. So in the Central Valley of California, we have three major hydrologic regions, and they are defined by the major river systems that flow through that our regions. The northern one is the Sacramento River hydrologic region, and basically starts up at Shasta, uh, Lake Shasta, and moves that which are the headwaters of the Sacramento River, and that hydrologic region is defined by the valley floor between the coastal range and the Sierra Nevada and the watershed or the drainage area of the Sacramento River as it flows from Lake Shasta all the way down to the northern end of the delta. And again, we'll talk more about this regime later and also the delta. We'll be dealing with that in later lectures or presentations. South of the Sacramento River area, which is also known as the Sacramento Valley, we have the San Joaquin Valley, which incorporates both the San Joaquin River drainage and also the Tulare-Kern River drainages. The San Joaquin hydrologic region is defined by the San Joaquin River and its tributaries. So basically, that's the north boundary of Fresno County. Moving north from there picks up the Fresno River, the Merced River, the Tuolumne River, and there's one more in there, the Stanislaus Rivers, that flow into the south end of the delta. And then moving further south, we have the Tulare Lake hydrologic region, which includes the Tule River, Tule River, the Kings River, and the Kern River. All of these drain into what was once the Tulare Lake, and you can see it labeled here, which is in western Kings County, one of the largest, at one time, largest inland lakes in the nation. Now it is all agricultural land because it's been reclaimed, and most of these rivers have been either controlled with dams or the water is used in other areas. So what we're talking about here are three major hydrologic regions of the valley, and they kind of define our groundwater systems as well, because remember, most of our groundwater in the valley is the result of the movement of surface water from the surface area through the Veda zone into the groundwater table. So in terms of a aquifer, here's just kind of a very simplistic view of a cross section of an aquifer. Again, we have the groundwater surface here, which is that's what you walk on. Then between that groundwater surface and the what we call the water table, or the free hydrostatic water surface, put it in engineering terms, is what's called the vadose zone. And that's just basically that area where you have moisture in the soil, but it's not saturated. A lot of this zone is what we call the root zone, or the upper areas of it are called the root zone, where all of our plant growth occurs. And that plant growth does absorb or take up some of the water that's percolating through the soil. So that is what we use when we irrigate. We're filling that void of area of that soil. But the water, as it moves down through the vadose zone, then hits something that makes it start to build up. And in this case, we have two conditions. One is prevalent in the valley, which is called a clay layer. And above that clay layer, which is impenetrable, in most cases, it's kind of just like concrete. It is so tight. It is saturated. The clay is, over years of having been have hydrostatic pressure built on it and forcing that water into the clay. Which has consequences we'll talk about later. But pretty much it creates a bathtub, bottom of a bathtub for what we call the upper aquifer. And then we have, generally below that clay layer, another deep layer of soil that is known as the lower aquifer. How does the water get through from the upper aquifer through the clay layer? Well, the clay layer is not totally continuous. It has fractures and fissures in it. So the water can move from the upper aquifer through those fissures into the lower aquifer, and it keeps percolating down until it hits bedrock and then starts to build back up until, if you have enough volume, which we have over the years built up, it then you end up with this aquifer encased on both sides of the clay layer. Some of you may be aware of what, artesian wells, and basically that's the result of a naturally occurring tube or fissure that extends from the ground surface all the way through the crown clay layer down into the lower aquifer. Because this lower aquifer is under pressure from the hydrostatic pressure above it, it can actually force water up through the surface, and that's where you get your artesian well effect. Okay. As I mentioned, in the Central Valley, you have your basically this is the San Joaquin Valley. Uh, on the west side of it is what we call the Corcoran clay layer. It is a geological effect of years of the deposition of fines and clay type soils that have been deposited by rivers and streams flowing down from the coastal range and partially from the Sierra Nevadas, that is built up over eons and is buried down there a couple 100 feet down between your more coarse soils on top. You have the Corcoran layer, clay layer that is built up from this alluvial deposition, and then more coarse soils below that. Uh, you can see that it extends from pretty much the north end of the San Joaquin Valley all the way down to Bakersfield, and from the foothills of the Coast Range eastward to almost mid-valley. And it is a significant geological feature in terms of groundwater, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. And also subsidence. So, oops. Aquifers, if you've been wondering what causes subsidence, aquifers are a major cause. In fact, they are the cause of that subsidence. And and what I should say is that we are the cause of it, but the aquifers are the depletion or the overuse of groundwater from these aquifers causes that subsidence. So let me explain that as best I can. First, let's start out with, is subsidence real? Yes, it is. You can see over here this famous picture of Dr. Pollard, who was a USGS scientist, illustrating in 1977 the amount of subsidence that has occurred since 1925 as we have accelerated our use of groundwater in the Tulare Lake Basin. And up here, you can see in 1925, this was the ground surface. In 1977, this was the ground surface, and there has been about 30 feet of subsidence in those areas on the west side of the valley that are overlay the Corcoran clay layer. So what causes that? Well, as we extract groundwater, we tend to remove water from those both the highly permeable soils that make up the water-bearing aquifer, and also because that water is moved out of those soils, it also tends to migrate out of the clay because of the release of the hydrostatic pressure on the clay layer. So they are now losing water as well. And simplistically, when you take water out, the space between the soil particles that used to be water is now air, and they tend to collapse. And you probably have maybe seen this. And that collapse is what causes subsidence. So in this slide, which is rather wordy, and I'll break it down very quickly for you, the two types of soils that we're dealing with here are those granular soils, which have a lot of what we call interstitial space around them, and this is where the water resides in an aquifer. And in granular soils, the water moves relatively freely along paths through the soil, through these spaces between the soil particles. And this is what we call the aquifer proper, and we drill wells into the granular soil strata to extract water, and it all works fairly well. But also if you go back to that original slide I showed you, you see that there is water on top of an aquifer, an upper aquifer, and then a clay layer, and then a lower aquifer. And over eons of time, as this valley has experienced water saturation, et cetera, these aquifers have built up. Primarily, a lot of it happened pre-development times, these clay layers also became saturated just because of this hydrostatic pressure that was on both sides of them that was forcing the water into the clays, which also created a separation between the clay particles. Once that water's been extracted over time for irrigation and domestic uses, we've relieved that hydrostatic pressure on the clay, and the water has moved out of the clay. And because clay layers are very linear in terms of their arrangement, they collapse and they tend to stay collapsed. Whereas with the granular soils, when you remove the water, they do collapse as well. But as you add the water back, it's what's called a rebound effect, and the soil expands back out. Not always to its full extent pre removal of the water, but it does come back 80 to 90%. But the clay does not come back. So what you end up with is a permanently, well, almost permanently compacted clay layer. So what's happening in terms of subsidence is we remove the water that's keeping the hydrostatic pressure on the clay layer. The clay layer has given up some of its water. The clay layer soil particles have realigned themselves and collapsed, and now the clay layer is thinner than what it used to be, and that's where the subsidence is happening. That's permanent, if you will. So here's just sort of a slide that shows you the effects of subsidence, and some of you may be aware of this. The Bryant-Kern Canal and the State Water Project Canal, the California Aqueduct, have both experienced some subsidence, which has caused a reduction in the capacity of these canals. And some cases, in the case of the Bryant-Kern, we're in the process of fixing that, and I'm sure that the California Aqueduct, we're going to go through the same process as well. But what happens when you end up with this clay layer collapsing, if you will, or below here, it creates a deflection in the soil layer above it, which then, if you have a rigid conduit, in the case of this pipeline, which cannot deflect as much as the soil subsides, you're going to get a break in the canal or the pipeline, and it will have a leak, which can cause other problems, and you'll have to go in and fix that. So that's one damage due to subsidence to our infrastructure. Another one is the reduction in the capacity of the canal. So here you can see a canal that has some depth of flow, which let's just for argument's sake say that's 2,000 cubic feet per second. Once we have some subsidence, the gradient is gone. It's reduced overall, because we've ended up with this drop in the overall gradient, and now we can't pass that full 2,000 cubic feet per second. It's going to be more like maybe 500. It's not that dramatic in the case of the Bryant-Kern Canal and the State Water Project, but it is a reduction, and it causes havoc for delivery of water throughout the state. But these are two undesirable impacts of subsidence, and why we want to arrest it and stop its impact. So shifting gears dramatically from that again, so we've talked about groundwater, where does it come from? What are the hydrologic regions? And then we've also talked about subsidence, which is one of those groundwater phenomena. Another one is that groundwater is not just water. It is water that contains what we call constituents. And when those levels of constituents become too high, they're called contaminants. What's the difference? Well, one is it's just there, but it's not harming you. And once it becomes to a level of concentration that it can harm you, it becomes a contaminant. Here's a list of the commonly occurring constituents that could become contaminants in groundwater. The top three, arsenic, selenium, and salts, are those that occur, generally speaking, naturally through the percolation of groundwater, of water as it moves through the soil. It picks up these, dissolves some of these elements that are naturally occurring, or these molecules or elements that are naturally occurring in the soil. And so it carries those down further into the groundwater table. Again, if they are not too high of concentration, then they are just a constituent in the water, and that's fine. But once they become too concentrated, or the concentration becomes too high, they become unsafe for you to consume, and they become a contaminant. The others that are not so naturally occurring are the nitrates and nitrogen. typically the result of fertilization or other types of nitrogen sources in the soil that we have added. Pesticides and herbicides, primarily organophosphates, because they are so soluble in water. Um, and then you have the water-soluble organic compounds that are the 1,2,3-dibromo-3 chloropropane, DBCP. Some of you may have heard of that, which was a nymicide, and then the trichloropropane, so 1,2,3-TCP, which is a byproduct of another nymicide. These are all things that we have added to the soil so that we can have a productive agricultural uh, business in the valley, and in some cases they have become a problem. So where do they come from? Um, Primarily from us, and because they're not naturally occurring components. But you can see here in this illustration that leakage from when we use the septic system, it's a very good way to treat waste from homes, but also it doesn't do a complete job of removing nitrates and nitrogen from the waste stream, so that the effluent is fairly concentrated in nitrogen and nitrates, so that can um, percolate into the groundwater if we have too much loading. Um, you can have underground storage tanks that are leaking. It used to be a large problem in the valley with underground storage tanks that had created leaks and were leaking petrochemicals into the groundwater, primarily gasoline. And some of the components that are in gasoline were a problem, like MTB. You have waste streams from dairy farms and other agricultural uses that create high loading of nitrogen and nitrates. And then you have other sources of where we have industrial uses. Uh, Landfills that haven't been properly designed and maintained can leak leachate into the groundwater, which is highly concentrated in these kind of bad actors. You have leaking containers and things that aren't well maintained, that are sort of industrial type of losses that can leak into the groundwater table. Um, a lot of people complain about the regulation in California, but a lot of our regulations are meant to stop this from happening. And so it's a good thing for us to be aware that we live in a highly industrialized society, and we need to also be aware that that can create problems, and particularly for our groundwater, which is a major source of drinking water. And you can see that down here in the aquifer. These types of pollutants tend to hang around what we call plumes. They don't always completely level themselves out or disseminate themselves out through the groundwater. They can end up in plumes. So you can see reports where wells have been closed because of a high concentration of contaminant, and then later that well is now reactivated because the plume has moved on past down gradient from where that well is. Just want to show you kind of in relative terms these a few slides that show you what that this valley and the water in the valley does have constituents in it, and that there are some places where it can be highly concentrated. And the advice, and you'll hear this later in one of the boot camps, is test your groundwater. If groundwater is your sole source of drinking water or domestic use, get it tested. So in just for reference here, this is the Central Valley. Tulare is right dead here in the center. A lot of this area is highly one of the most productive agricultural areas in the world. So a lot of these constituents you'll see that we're going to go through are the result of what we do here to provide an economy for us. Uh, this is wells that have tested for levels of nitrate. Um, and you can see that the level over here on the right is 10 milligrams per liter, which is sort of that level of where we want to be conscious of where it crosses over from a constituent to a contaminant. The yellow markers in here delineate high concentrations of nitrates and nitrogen as measured by nitrogen. The low darker blue are moderate, and the lighter blue are low. So you can see that we in the valley have a pretty high degree of higher concentrations of nitrate and nitrogen, both in the moderate and high levels. Here is fumigants, which again we talked about DBCP and trichloropropane. Uh, again, the yellow being high concentrations above 3 milligrams per liter, and lower concentrations, high concentrations being yellow, and then blue, dark blue, and light blue. You can see a lot of yellow in this area, meaning that it is a possibility to counter these fumigants in your groundwater. And then finally, herbicides, which are another source of contamination from our agricultural uses here, and also, just personal uses around our homes. But you can see that again, there is a possibility for the prevalence or of these types of constituents becoming contaminants in your groundwater. So we emphasize the fact that if you are using groundwater for drinking sources, you should test your water. How do we treat groundwater? Very quickly, I'm just going to buzz through this. There are a couple of ways. If you are in your home and you have a personal use, you can buy filtration systems. I recommend that you look at those that have granulated activated carbon canisters because they're going to be the most effective against the types of the organophosphates, the herbicides, and the nemacides. When it comes to nitrates, you're going to need a special resin type of canister, so be aware of that. Nitrate treatment on a individual basis is pretty difficult, so you have to be thinking about how you want to manage that. But in terms of commercial treatment, typically what we do is we'll drill wells into the contamination plume. We'll pull that water out, typically put it in a holding tank, and then run it through a treatment system that consists of usually air stripping and then GAC, granulated activated carbon. And then we'll do two things with that treated water. We'll either put it back in the aquifer to further dilute the plume, or we'll use it for drinking water systems. And then you can see that either side, what we're doing is monitoring the quality of that water to see how long we need to treat it. Another system is a resin ion exchange. So you can do this for a whole house treatment. Basically, this is better used for nitrate removal. And basically, it's like your soft water treatment. It's a tank that has, instead of salt in it, or resin balls that are activated to treat for nitrates removal. And then another system that is used both in a commercial and in a house is a reverse osmosis, which basically will treat your water to distill water quality. And the downside to is it does take energy. It's because you have to pressure force water through a membrane, but it's very effective. And we're working on ways to make that energy more prevalent and cheaper so that we can use reverse osmosis to treat commercially. And then a patented biological removal, primarily used in commercial treatment, or so like for a city or a county water treatment system, which is highly effective for the removal of nitrate and nitrogen, but requires a high degree of technical expertise. So that's that. I think we pretty much buzzed through this. So if there are any questions, we're going to try to provide reasonable answers to those.
Okay, at this time we will be addressing questions submitted via chat. It is not too late to submit your questions. Please add them to the chat function in YouTube. Okay, question one. Can subsidize be reversed?
Oh, subsidence. Yes.
Subsidence.
Okay. So it can to a certain extent. So if you have granular soils that have been collapsed because of extraction of groundwater, replacing that lost groundwater will cause those granular soils, the sands and the gravels, to rebound to about what I've been told, 80 to 90% of their previous volume. So as you remove that groundwater, the soils collapse, those granular soil particles collapse against each other, put the water back, they then spread apart. So that makes the soil rebound. But that water extracted from the or lost from the clay layers is very incredibly, I mean, that rebound takes eons of time, not years of time, because we're talking about geological movement. So what you're doing is the water is leaving those clay layer soils. The particles tend to be more bound together both by electromagnetic forces, uh, electric charge forces, as well as the way they are oriented. So they do not rebound when you try to put the water back in. In fact, it's very difficult to force the water back in to make those particles spread apart. So the collapse of clay layers is pretty much permanent from a human standpoint, whereas the collapse of granular soils can be reversed.
Okay, question two. Are some hydrologic regions in California more vulnerable to groundwater depletion than others?
Um, Well, that's a very good question because yes, in a way they are. The further south you go, so if you get into the San Joaquin and the Tulare Lake basins, the average annual rainfall decreases from is about 11 to 9 inches. So we have less, and then also our snowpack in the southern and central Sierra is not as great as it is in the northern Sierra and the Siskiyous. So because of the less average annual rainfall and the less average annual snowfall, we have less surface water that can be used to recharge the groundwater table. So we are more susceptible to the overdraft of the groundwater. And you can see as if you go in to look at the groundwater bulletin, you can see where we have more overdraft in the San Joaquin Valley and the Tulare Lake Basin than you do in the Sacramento River Valley, mainly because we have less rainfall and less snowfall available. And so we rely more on groundwater to grow our crops here.
Okay, next question. If they collapse to 80 to 90% of previous volume, if it is done multiple times, does it rebound to 80 to 90% of the original volume or 80 to 90% of the previous level,
Mhm.
eventually shrinking to minuscule?
Um, my understanding, I have to admit, I am a civil engineer, not a geologist. So my understanding is that you pretty much uh, can rebound to 80 to 90% over repeated. So there's not a his there the heuristics of it are not permanent. Uh, so you don't like take it the next step and the next step and the step as you get closer to the wall. You as long as you can bring the water back, levels back, you can get that rebound in the granular soils back to near normal or what they were historically, but you won't get it all the way back. There'll be some permanent loss in the granular soils as as well.
Okay, is there an interaction between the confined and unconfined water when a well is drilled through the clay layer?
Okay, yeah, good question. Uh, yes, there can be. Most well regulations that we have require the sealing of the casing um, so that you're not causing that interaction between the two aquifers. But uh, improperly drilled wells or wells that aren't drilled per regulation can cause a migration of water from upper aquifer to lower aquifer if the pressures are right, or from the lower aquifer to the upper aquifer. And one of the things that we're trying to avoid is the movement of contamination plumes from, may say, an upper aquifer down to a lower aquifer. So that's why we try to isolate the two aquifers when we're drilling wells, because we don't want to just punch holes and allow that contamination plumes to move freely between the two.
Okay, that was all the questions in the chat. If you have additional questions that we did not address, please email us.
Okay, thank you, Victoria. Appreciate it. Thanks
Mhm.
for being with us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for joining us for this session. We hope it was informative. This session was recorded and will be available on YouTube until June 15th. Before we take a break, I would like to invite you to join the CWI listserv by following the link on the QR code. This will ensure you are the first to learn about CWI's projects and events. Thank you again for joining us this morning. We hope to see you at future water bootcamp sessions. Good morning. If you joined us earlier, welcome back. If this is your first session, thank you for joining us and welcome to the Water Bootcamp brought to you by the California Water Institute at Fresno State. We hope you enjoyed the Fresno State Jazz Band while we got started. My name is Victoria Vera. I am a junior at Fresno State studying business, and I will be the moderator for these sessions. As I mentioned earlier, these virtual education sessions are brought to you by the California Water Institute at Fresno State. CWI is celebrating 25 years of working to integrate and coordinate Fresno State's interdisciplinary research and education of water-related programs. We do this in collaboration with water stakeholders to facilitate the development and communication of research-based solutions to water challenges in California. The mission of CWI is to connect academia to the water community to solve water management challenges through education and research. To achieve this, we engage faculty and students in developing interdisciplinary research-based solutions to water challenges for a sustainable water future. In celebration of Water Awareness Month, CWI is hosting 3 water boot camps in English and 1 in Spanish this month. This morning's session is all about groundwater. We started with providing you all an overview. We are now moving into recharge, and lastly, we will talk about regulations. You can submit questions as we go on the YouTube chat feature. There is a slight delay between the presentations, so please ask your questions as they come to mind so we can make sure the speakers are able to get them on time. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentations. This session's speaker is CWI's Director Laura Ramos. Director Ramos has been working on water issues in California at Fresno State for over 23 years. And now to talk about groundwater recharge, it is my pleasure to welcome Director Ramos to the virtual stage.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Victoria, for that introduction and for telling us all about CWI. As Victoria mentioned, I'm going to talk about groundwater recharge. There we go. Sorry for that delay. So as I mentioned earlier, we're going to talk about recharge, and we'll start with what is groundwater recharge, and then we'll move in from there to what are some of the sources of water that are used for recharge, what are some of the types of systems, the reasons we do recharge, some of the different types of methods, and then what are some of the timelines that must be taken into consideration as recharge is done. So you probably have seen this graphic in several of our presentations. So just a little bit a reminder on the water cycle. One of the items that we didn't talk about in the water cycle is that, water falls in the form of water or rain or snow, and then it comes into our rivers, into our lakes, and some of it, as you can see from the graphic, it ends up going down into some of it evaporates, some of it moves forward into where its destination is, but in some cases, it will percolate into the ground. And so this is one additional item that happens during that cycle. Earlier, you heard Assistant Director Cordy Qualley talk about groundwater and what are the different aquifers and then the confining clay layer. And so groundwater recharge is a lot last in, first out. And so most of the water starts in what Cordy mentioned was a veto zone. And then it goes through that into the upper aquifer, and at times it'll stay there depending on how long it's making its way down. And then we pump it, and so it is the last one that is into the aquifer, and so it's the first one pumped out. And so the water that has been the longest in our groundwater would be what is in the lower aquifer that keeps continuing being pushed down due to gravity. So what is groundwater recharge? Groundwater recharge is water that we purposely add to our aquifers. Either we do this naturally or in a planned system. You might have seen around the San Joaquin Valley and all over California, they almost look like ponds. And some of them are in the cities and some of them are in our rural areas. And those are planned systems that are either used for flood control of communities, but then they also end up doing recharge, or they're planned recharge basins or recharge banks that are around our rural areas. In order to put water into those areas, you have it comes from many different sources, and you have to have the rights to those waters. Or some kind of permit to move those waters into these recharge basins or for discharging of those water. The first one and probably the most popular one is just local flood water. If there is excess water in a year like 2023 where the water isn't being used in the communities or in the farms because the fields are dormant or there's just not as high of a need for the water during that time, we tend to use all of those water and either place it in recharge basins and flood control basins to make sure that we are able to use it for future years. If you think about it in a financial way or to compare it, it is the groundwater, the water that is in our aquifers is similar in comparison to savings account. And the surface water is similar to a checkings account. You have your water that comes in the form of rain and snow. You use what you can use that during that time. What you can't use, you then put into your savings account. And so this is what we do with groundwater recharge. We are putting water and adding it to our savings account to be able to use when there isn't surface water available. But also we use surface water that's imported from other regions. If you joined us earlier in the month, we talked about the hydrologic regions in California and how water is imported from one watershed to another. And so at times it could be surface water that we are purchasing or moving through the system that we are able to import from other hydrologic regions into our region and use that for recharge. Another very popular source of water is recycled water. It goes through the treatment plants. And then once it's treated, it can be used for recharge, and it's traditionally used near the water treatment plants, but they also have a long permitting process, and they have to have a permit for the recharge for the discharge of that water, and it has to meet specific water quality standards to be able to do that. And so what are some of the different types of recharge systems and how we do that? So we do it in two different ways. One of them is just we naturally recharge our systems, and then others are specifically planned ones. Natural recharge happens when it rains. If it's raining, for example, in my backyard, the grass will take naturally, my lawn will take the water that is needed, and then the rest will percolate through the soil and into the aquifer. And so that happens in our parks or any area that is not covered or cemented, that water can percolate through. Another one is just natural water flows, as I mentioned earlier in the graphic. When water is moving through an area that isn't lined or isn't covered, water will naturally seep through and make its way into our aquifers. A very similar one is rivers. And unlined canal, as you see from the graphic, water will, even though it's moving quickly from the top, there is still some water that is having an opportunity to do recharge. And then very similar to the example that I mentioned earlier about a backyard is crop irrigation. Plants will take the water that they need. They will not take excess water. And so if we put in excess water in a field or in a crop, the crop will take the amount of water that it needs, and then the rest will be going down into our recharge basin. And so when you see some of the fields that are either flooded, and if they're flooded with surface water, you're accomplishing two different things. You are irrigating the crop and then you're also doing recharge because the crop is only taking what it needs and then it follows through. And then some urban landscapes, as I mentioned earlier, large parks, large areas where there's just greenery and that it's not covered. And anytime water falls down there, either through rain or that we're irrigating the crop, or sorry, the turf will take what it needs and then the rest will be recharged. But then we also have some that are more planned. We have recharge basins or ponds and then flood ponds, which the flood ponds are commonly used in an urban area where we try to move the water quickly when it's raining away from our neighborhoods so that there isn't flooding of homes. And so we move it quickly into these flood ponds. Sometimes it is stored there temporarily while it is moved to another area, but in the meantime, it is doing some flooding. But also during the non-rainy times of the year, it can be used for recharge, but its primary use is for flood control. And so at times you will see them empty and then you will see them full. And it's because if there is a rain expected, those ponds needs to be ready and emptied to make sure that they take in all of that flood water. And then they move that water and they empty them out. And then at times they can be used as recharge basins, just like other recharge basins, such as the one that was in the photo earlier of the city of Fresno, which is Leaky Acres, which is near 168 and the Ashland. And so you see those areas where they're specifically planned to put recharge water in them. What are some of the reasons that we do recharge? As I mentioned earlier, one of them is to replenish our depleted aquifers. We've extracted too much water from our groundwater, which was traditionally used as our savings account. And so we want to replenish it. We don't want to continue just extracting water from it, but we want to add water to it. And so one of the primary reasons is to replenish our aquifers. But also there are other instances where we want to do other things. In the graphic that you see on the screen, it is an example of preventing saltwater intrusion. And so this graphic is something that would be near the coast. As you can see, there are 3 different levels of colors of water. One where you see is seawater. The middle section with the saltwater intrusion is where the seawater is kind of combining itself with fresh water. And as we deplete groundwater because we're extracting it and then using pumps that change the flow of that water, we're pulling in too much seawater. And so if we're continuously doing that, we're going to lose some of that fresh water and we're going to be pumping seawater. And so instead, we want to put water, we want to do some recharge of fresh water so that the more fresh water there is in that aquifer, it's pushing away some of that saltwater intrusion. So we do it for both for savings, for replenish our aquifers, but also to prevent saltwater intrusion. And so what is the timeline? Because sometimes you might think, well, it just rained, so will my the level of groundwater table increase right away? So it all depends on many, many things, many factors, and some of them are the soil type. If you have a very sandy soil, the water will probably recharge a lot quicker than some of the other ones, but in some cases you might have a very sandy soil in the top layer of the vetozone layer, and so you might have like 10 feet of very sandy soil that you're thinking, oh, it's going to recharge very quickly, but then 10 feet under there is a clay area, and so it'll get stuck there. So it all depends on where all of that different types of soil is and how it is moving through the system. So some areas might move faster than others, and it could be as short as just 1 mile away can be completely different because all of our soils are completely different from one area to the next. And so it depends on the type of soil that you have, all the way from the top of the soil all the way onto where the water table is. And also the basin conditions. It depends on how it's used in the past. Has it subsided, and what making sure that we keep those basins healthy to make sure they're not clogged with contaminants that can prevent the passing through of some of this water. As you might have seen in some of the flood ponds, there are times of the years or throughout the years where you see them doing some maintenance on it. And what they're doing is that they're pulling off a very thin top layer that has been kind of clogging the soil because of the different contaminants or items that the water comes through it. And so it's important that they take that off and maintain the basin conditions healthy so that the water continues to pass through. Some of this water can take as long as 8 years, depending on the soil conditions, and some of them you might see a change in the water table within 1 year. So it all depends on all of the different factors that are around that area. What are some of the methods that we use for recharge? In this graphic created by DWR, you can see that there are different ways that it's being recharged. One of them is during floodplains. In the first one, there's floodplains that are used for habitat. And so some of that water in wetlands can be the water can be pulled in there, and then it'll eventually do its recharge. If you see here, this next one, active farmland. So it could be farmland that is active but is dormant during the winter season. And so we're able to flood some of those fields without affecting the crop and using that land for recharge and preventing a flood to other areas. But also, as you can see right to the right, they're doing some fallowing fields that are fallowed that they're also recharging. And so they're using those fields just like without crops, but just flooding them because they're preventing flood of the other areas and also using them for recharge and temporarily recharge. Another way, like I talked about earlier, are just recharge basins or recharge banks that have a specific purpose of using that land for recharge and can hold a lot more water than some of the fallowed fields because it's a field, it's not deep, or some of the active farmland. As we talked about earlier, some of the methods that we do for recharges, agriculture fields, flood irrigation, seepage through lake beds, irrigation tanks, streams, unlined canals, but also one of the newer things that we're doing is injection wells. An injection well is very similar to a well that we use to pump water out, but instead of pumping water out, we're using it reversely to pump water into the aquifer. And so it's a lot faster, but it also has a lot more regulations and permits that are needed for the quality of that water. Because the water is getting there quickly, we're not using the natural groundwater way of treating that water as it makes its way down. And so it has a lot more regulations. But then, like I said earlier, we also have recharge ponds. One of the things I have not touched on very much during this presentation is recharge banks. And the difference between a recharge basin, pond, and a recharge bank is that normally a recharge basin or a pond is owned by a landowner that specifically wants to recharge the aquifer that is directly underneath their property. And so they have the rights to that water and they're putting it there. The other option is there are several recharge banks throughout California where the person that wants to do the recharging of that water to add it for their savings account doesn't own the land where that water is being recharged. It is managed and owned by an agency that this is its purpose. And so water can be sent there by somebody who owns the rights to that water, and they make an agreement with the recharge bank. And so the water is recharged there. And then as it's needed, it's moved back into the area where the or the owner of those water rights wants, and it's ready to be used in. So it's very similar to a bank where you don't own the bank, you don't own the property, but you want to place the water there for future use instead of building a recharge recharge basin directly on your property. But also, one of the more newer-ish technologies is subsurface artificial recharge. In both of these that I mentioned, the recharge basins, recharge ponds, recharge banks, you're taking land out of use, whether it's an urban use where we have different homes, you're taking that land and not being able to use it for homes or for agriculture, but instead you're using it for recharge. A subsurface artificial recharge happens completely underneath the ground, underneath the root zone, and it does not damage. And so there's several benefits to that. We talked about injection wells. And so a little bit more about the underground recharge or subsurface recharge. This is a picture of something that was built here at Fresno State. We have an area where we were going to plant brand new almond trees, and so it was perfect time to install this technology so we could test it. It can also be done in an established field. It just takes different type of technology to install something. So where it's easier to install the technology if the land is bare, and then you're going to grow on it. And so here is how that technology works. One of the benefits is that you are able to filter the water and control the water quality of the water that you're putting into the ground. And so as you can see from the graphic, the leach lines are underneath the root zone. And so they're not affecting the crop. They're not providing more or less water to the crop. So you have a standpipe where you put the water in, you have the leach lines, and so you go underneath, and then you're able to increase the water table by recharging it lower than that. What are some of the advantages and disadvantages of the subsurface artificial groundwater recharge? As the first one and the most important one is that you don't have to take land out of production or what its current or future use will be. You can still use your drip irrigation systems, and you can continue using any irrigation system as you were using before because it does not affect it. Works in locations where there is specifically no flood irrigation capabilities. And so you might have this additional benefit. It occurs below, and so it doesn't leach a lot of the accumulated salts, nitrates, or pesticides and herbicides that are in the top portion of the soil. And so they're not pushing it and flushing it down as much into the groundwater. You can recharge at any time when the water is available. It doesn't have to just be when a crop is dormant or when we're not using the fields. You can recharge year round. It does not promote weed growth because it's so far down lower, and there is no mosquito breeding because the water is not just standing on the top of the surface. But it also comes with some disadvantages. The first one being that it requires pumping to filter the water. And so you want to make sure that the water, for one, that is filtered to make sure it does not clog the system or cause any damage to the system. The benefit of that is you're recharging a higher level quality of water into the ground. It uses your drip filters, so that can impact your backwashing and your requirements. And so you might have additional filter rehabilitation that has to be done. There is the construction cost to do it, and it's best implemented, as I said, in a brand new field, but it can also be done in an existing field, and it requires just monitoring of the water that is applied and where the water is moving. At Fresno State, as I mentioned earlier, we have one that we put in near Willow and Bullard, and it was at the time they had a plan to plant some almonds, and in the meantime, before those were planted, we were able to install the system. And it has some laterals, and here's just some pictures of where the pump is, where the perforated recharge pipes are, the valves, and then the standpipe location for those. installing it, because the land was bare, was easy. And as you can see on the photo down on the bottom, it is now almond trees that are growing above the system, and they do not affect the system. We had 50-foot deep borings to check the stratosphere. So they first checked all of the land. We had some students helping out there, taking soil samples to give them some experience, but also to learn more about the soil where we were going to do some recharge. We also included a lot of moisture sensors all the way down to 32 feet. And we did this because it was a research plot. And so we wanted to make sure that we would learn how the system worked. Did the water go all the way to the bottom? Did it start floating up to the sides? And so we installed these moisture sensors so that we can monitor the movement of that water and how deep it went down. We very much control the surface water quality, and we have not done any groundwater quality testing to see if it dilutes any of the contaminants or that if it makes any changes to it. We hope that we can do that in future research studies, but we did do a lot of testing of the quality of the water that we were putting in. And so we test specifically for pH, conductivity, total dissolved solids, salinity, as well as coliform, to make sure that the water quality that we were recharging was a high quality one. And that is my presentation, Victoria.
Okay, at this time we will be addressing questions submitted via chat. It is not too late to submit your questions. Please add them to the chat function in YouTube. Okay. Question 1. What are the biggest challenges to implementing a recharge system on a farm or in a city?
Oh, great question. Thank you for that question. So some of the biggest challenges, one of the main ones being the availability of water. So in order to put water into these basins, you must have the rights to that water. And so first of all, the challenge is water available in your area? Do you have the rights to it? Do you have the conveyance to get the water to where you need to get it? And then just dealing with the permitting and of that water. Now, in a farm, one of the biggest challenges that you want to use as much land to grow your crop, and so you will have to take land out of production to do that. In a city, it's a little bit easier.
Okay, that was all the questions in the chat. If you have additional questions that we did not address, please email us. Thank you for joining us for this session. We hope it was informative. The session was recorded and will be available on YouTube until June 15th. Before we take a break, I would like to invite you to join the CWI listserv by following the link on the QR code to be the first to learn about CWI's projects. We will now transition to a short break. Good morning. If you joined us earlier, welcome back. If this is your first session, thank you for joining us and welcome to the Water Bootcamp brought to you by the California Water Institute at Fresno State. We hope you enjoyed the Fresno State Jazz Band while we got started. My name is Victoria Vera. I am a junior at Fresno State studying business, and I will be the moderator for these sessions. As I mentioned earlier, these virtual education sessions are brought to you by the California Water Institute at Fresno State. CWI is celebrating 25 years of working to integrate and coordinate Fresno State's interdisciplinary research and education of water-related programs. We do this in collaboration with water stakeholders to facilitate the development and communications of water research-based solutions to water challenges in California. The mission of CWI is to connect academia to the water community to solve water management challenges through education and research. To achieve this, we engage faculty and students in developing interdisciplinary research-based solutions to water challenges for a sustainable water future. In celebration of Water Awareness Month, CWI is hosting 3 water boot camps in English and 1 in Spanish this month. This morning's session is all about groundwater. We started with providing you all an overview, followed by recharge, and now moving on to regulation. You can submit questions as we go on the YouTube chat function feature. There is a slight delay between the presentation, so please ask your questions as they come to mind so we make sure the speakers are able to get them on time. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. This session speaker is CWI's Director, Laura Ramos. Director Ramos has been working on water issues in California at Fresno State for over 23 years. And now to talk about groundwater regulation, it is my pleasure to welcome Director Ramos to the virtual stage.
Good morning, and thank you, Victoria, for that introduction. As Victoria mentioned, I will be talking about groundwater regulations. So where do regulations come from for groundwater? And we can have regulations that come from the federal, from the state, as well as local area for counties. And so some states can have different than others, and some counties can have different regulations versus others. Because the regulations, just like other laws, can come and affect a very specific area. And specifically today, I'm going to talk mostly about the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, which is a regulation that affects all and anybody pumping any water in California. We are actually one of the few last states that did not regulate groundwater extraction for years before SGMA started. And so SGMA, its main purpose is to make sure that our groundwater resources are sustainable, and we are to do that within 20 years. The law was signed into effect in 2014. We'll go over a little bit of the timeline, and the most of the specific action started in 2020, and we are to be sustainable by the year 2040. And so there are some, I call them the desirable results, but if you look at a lot of the SGMA regulations and the information, they're the opposite. They call them undesirable results. And so the reason why I do this is because those are things that we don't want. I want to focus on the things that we do want. And so SGMA, what they want to do is to make sure that we are increasing the groundwater level. We don't want to continue it decreasing. And so as we increase our groundwater levels, we also want to increase groundwater storage. And so we don't have enough groundwater because we've extracted so much. We want to increase that by putting more water that is stored underneath the ground. We want to reduce seawater intrusion, as you saw, or if you joined us for the earlier session, we talked about seawater intrusion. And so in some of the coastal areas, Sigma would help with that. We also want to increase our water quality that is stored in the groundwater. And so the more water we pump out, the lower the water quality is. And so we want to make sure that the water quality is increased because we're adding additional water. We also want to decrease land subsidence and prevent it from happening anymore. We pumped out so much groundwater, and if you joined us for the earlier session, Cordy Qualley talked to us about subsidence, and so we want to prevent that. It's causing too much damage to our infrastructure, and we want to make sure that we reduce it. We also want to increase and maintain the interconnected between surface water and groundwater. There's a lot of ecosystems that are dependent on that connectivity, and we want to make sure that they continue being healthy because we're maintaining that connectivity. As I mentioned earlier, Sigma was passed in the year 2014. And the very first step that it included was that we needed to divide the groundwater basins into different areas, to specific basins that were some were critically overdrafted, some were high, some were medium, and some were low. So if we think of all of these areas, think of them as independent bathtubs that are all kind of cut together. There could be some connectivity between them, but it's very low, but they remain very high within that area. And so the Department of Water Resources did some work to kind of be able to determine our groundwater, like I said earlier, tends to all be connected, but there are some areas that are that it's more confined into the area. And so that was the first step, to divide all of our groundwater into the basins and then determine which ones had what priority based on how much water had been pumped out of those aquifers. The next step was the formation of groundwater sustainability agencies, also known as GSAs, and that happened in 2017. And there was a very specific mandate in the Sigma legislation that said that groundwater was best managed locally. And so in order to do that, they allowed those areas within the subbasin to create these agencies based on what their local needs were. And so this basin, these GSAs were created. And so if one basin had multiple GSAs, they just had to make sure that there were agreements between all of them, that they were all going to make sure that the basin was sustainable and what those plans were to be sustainable, but they all include different agencies. And so if you think about these as the basin is similar to a county. It's a geographical area that has many cities within it that kind of work independently, but all are kind of connected in some ways by freeways or streets, and water can move around them. So the basin would be similar to what a county is, and then the GSA would be similar to what a city is. A basin has several GSAs that all work together for the health of that same basin. And then we have several basins within California, specifically in the San Joaquin Valley. And so the next mandate after each of these agencies was formed was that each of these agencies had to create by the year 2020 a plan on what they were going to do to ensure the long-term sustainability of that groundwater basin. And as I said earlier, each of the agencies would have their own, but they had to make sure that within the basin, they all worked together and had one overall plan that worked for all of them together based on their individual plans. And so what are some of the components? If any of you have read or have even looked at some of those GSPs, there's thousands of pages long and they're all slightly different. But in the they had a very specific outline that they had to follow to make sure that that they included, the plans included what the legislation required them to include, and that they were just very similar in nature for all of those components. And so all of the GSPs are 5 chapters. The most of the chapters all follow the same outline. And so you can find a lot of very similar information from one chapter to the other. From one plan to another. And all of them, there are 3 key components that you should look at, or you should be focusing on. One of them is the minimum threshold. Minimum threshold is a numeric value of each of the sustainability indicators that I mentioned earlier. And it is, how are they going to define that for that specific area in that GSP. The next one is a sustainable yield. And so the sustainable yield is a maximum quantity of water that is going to be extracted, and it's calculated over a base period representing long-term conditions in that subbasin, and includes any temporary surplus that can be withdrawn naturally or withdrawn annually for the groundwater supply without causing those undesirable results that we talked about earlier. So it's how much water can we pull out annually and still be sustainable. The other one was measurable objectives. And so the measurable objectives are very specific, quantifiable goals for maintaining and improving the specified groundwater conditions. And so these definitions and these names will be consistent between all of the GSPs, and you'll be able to find them, but they will be different for every single basin and every single groundwater sustainability agency, because as I said earlier, it is up to the locals to determine what these numbers are. And so one will be different from another, but I wanted to make sure that as you're reading those plans, that these are some of the phrases that you're keeping an eye out for. The next timeline was 2022, and those were for the second round or the next round of basin plans, and those were for ones that had a high and medium priority basins. So one was the very critical ones, and then were for the next set of them. And so what happens with those plans once they're created and submitted? You might have seen some that are already that you might hear that these are in review, these are conditionally approved, inadequate, incomplete. So I kind of wanted to give you a overall definition or timeline of how this is happening and what some of these items mean as you learn about the area that your groundwater sustainability agency is, and you want to know the status of those plans. So no matter what plan you were in and what stage of the approval process you were in, you were to start implementing it. And so you created your plan before you hear from the Department of Water Resources, you're already implementing. They didn't want anyone to wait until you were 5 years in, 10 years in. We wanted to make sure, or they wanted to make sure, that there was those 20 years that were allotted for being sustainable, that you were using all of those 20 years and not starting later. And so no matter where in the process the GSAs were, the plans were already implemented. And so the first step was that those plans were to be submitted to the Department of Water Resources to make their decision on those plans. And so they had 3 different areas. Either it was approved or it was 2 different areas. Approved, incomplete, or inadequate. But there's first 2 of them that happened at the beginning. And so if you were conditionally approved, that meant the Department of Water Resources agreed with everything that was in your plan, but they might have some recommendations for corrective actions. But those corrective actions weren't big or detrimental, but they still were recommending that those were implemented. And the reason they call it conditionally approved is because they're monitoring, or the Department of Water Resources is monitoring that the implementation of that GSP is continuing, and it was supposed to be adaptive management. With men, you learn and you manage it, and then you adapt if there are things that you see that need to be changed. And so there are annual and 5-year reports that are sent over to Department of Water Resources to make sure that you report how you're implementing that plan. And so if at any time during that process, the Department of Water Resources sees that it's not being implemented correctly or not being implemented, then they can move back to an incomplete area. And so that's why it's conditionally approved. You're approved until there is something that happens that they need to pull that back. Now, incomplete ones were ones that needed corrective actions, but that action was too great. And so it wasn't something that was easily fixed, or that it needed to go back and needed additional changes. And so once they were determined incomplete, they went back to the GSAs to make those changes, and then a new format, or a new plan was submitted to DWR. And so they had 180 days. The GSAs had 188 days to make those corrective actions, to make those changes to the plan. Once it came back to the Department of Water Resources to be reviewed, once those changes were made that they were recommending, it could be conditionally approved, or it was sent to State Water Board. And so there was consultation between both the Department of Water Resources and the State Water Resources Control Board to see some consultation and see what can they do to help. Are there still some minor things that with those consultations, those plans can be changed and adjusted to be approved, or were those changes just too significant that the plan was determined inadequate? If the plan it was determined inadequate, that meant that it was no longer up to the locals to determine the plan and to determine their own sustainable yield, their own minimum threshold, or their own measurable objectives. But now the State Water Board was going to intervene, and they were going to create that plan for that area. This is actually happening in a few of the basins in the San Joaquin Valley. Some of them are were determined inadequate, and they're working with the water board. Some of them were determined inadequate but have since moved on to being approved. So it's not something that they completely stay in. They can move out of that, but we're still learning what an agency has to do in order to get out of that inadequate area, and how they can best work with the water board to make sure that their plan is adequate. And as I mentioned earlier, throughout this entire process, and no matter whether your plan was incomplete, you already had a plan and you had to be implementing it throughout this entire time. Just a little bit more about the incomplete process and the diagram on it. If the GSP's deficiency precluded approval, then they got a letter, they consulted with them, and then final notices were sent out, and they were no later than 2 years from there. And so once they were determined incomplete, then the GSAs had the 180 days to address those deficiencies. If, as I mentioned earlier, if they were determined inadequate, or then they had 180 days after the notice and public hearing. The State Water Board can designate that the basin be in probation for a year. And so if they are in probation because it's inadequate, then they're working with the State Water Board to look at those plans and to see what are some of those changes that can be made to get that basin out of probation. If the deficiencies are not remedied during those probation period, then the State Water Board can develop and adapt an interim plan during that time to make sure that the basin continues to implement some of the plans to be sustainable in the long term. And so the goal of this plan is that we are sustainable long term. Our groundwater was once used as a backstop for water needed in the San Joaquin Valley. We would use our rainwater, our snow melt, and we would use that for all of the needs of the San Joaquin Valley. When there wasn't enough, we would pump our groundwater, and naturally our water was being recharged. That is no longer happening because of how much land is no longer being able to be percolated because we've covered over it with either homes, roads, and so not as much is naturally being recharged, as well as there isn't, because of the dramatic changes in our climate where we're getting the same amount of precipitation but more in rain than snow, we're not able to use the management systems that we once did. And so we're not able to recharge as much naturally. And so that means that we've been pumping and pumping a lot more, causing damage to our aquifers and to our infrastructure. And so this law strives to prevent some of that from happening and to slow down all of the pumping that we've done in our groundwater and be sustainable by the year 2040, which means that we have water for the future, but more importantly, that our aquifers are healthy. A great resource that any of you might be able to access is the DWR's Sigma portal. The Sigma portal and the website is on there. If somebody could please grab that and paste it into the chat for our guests to be able to just copy and paste it into their browsers, that'd be great. Thank you. And so when you go to here, you can either see a GSP or a GSA. So you can find out who the contact person is for the groundwater sustainability agencies, what agencies form which part of the basin, and as well as see their most up-to-date plan and the status of that plan. Is it conditionally approved? Is it incomplete? Are they on probation? So you can find out at this portal all of the different information specific to all of those areas. If you are unsure of what area you're in, a great resource from this website, which if you go, you would go on the GSA map viewer. If you go to the map viewer, you can put in your address or select an area. And once you select it, it will tell you what is the name of the groundwater sustainability agency that is part of that, what is, who is the contact person, and what is their website. And one of the things that I would encourage all of you to do, if you have questions about your specific GSA and GSP area, is that you go to this viewer and confirm which GSA you are in. Some of the times we tend to talk to our neighbor or our friends and say, oh, this is a requirement for us. And you're like, oh, well, you know, this farmer lives right across from me, and therefore we're in the same one. But there could be that the boundary is right on the street that is different from your neighbor. And so it is important that you confirm that you're in the right GSA and the right GSP for your specific location, and make sure that what you're learning about your GSA is specific to you, because all of the plans and the regulations are very different, one GSA to another. And so it's important that you find specifically which one it is. And this is a great resource from the Department of Water Resources that you can go and just put in your address, and you can identify which GSA is the one that you should ask questions specific to you. And that is all that I had for my presentation, Victoria.
Okay, at this time we'll be addressing questions submitted via chat. It is not too late to submit your questions. Please add them to the chat function in YouTube. Okay, question 1. Can you talk about justifications it if current in sorry, where did I leave? And if current injunctions in water basins are leading that way?
So thank you, Victoria. I'd be glad to talk about adjudications. And so those are ones where there was already there was already a contradiction or lack of agreement within a specific basin. And some of these adjudications happen pre-Sigma and some are happening after Sigma. And those specific basins were already having concerns about the health of that aquifer. And there were so many concerns that there was lawsuits. And so it was a judge that determined the sustainable yield. They might not be calling them that because these terms were part of the Sigma regulation, but they were areas where there was very specifically a judge determined how and what numbers were going to make that area sustainable. And so they kind of already had a plan indirectly, but it was dictated to them by a judge. And so I don't believe those are in the portals, but you can find out more if there is an adjudication. I'm not able to answer the second part, which is if current injunctions and water basins are leading the way or not, but I'd be glad to grab that question. If you send me an email, then we can make sure that we address that because I don't know the answer, but I'll make sure that I get an answer for you.
That was all the questions in the chat. If you have additional questions that we did not address, please email us. Thank you for joining us for this session. We hope it was informative. This session was recorded and will be available on YouTube until June 15th. Before we take a break, I would like to invite you to join the CWI listserv by following the link on the QR code to be the first to learn about CWI's projects. We will now transition to a short break.